All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We have a special presentation this morning from Peggy Reiff Miller, who will be talking about, as you can see on the screen right now, the Seagoing Cowboys and the Heifer Project delivering hope to a war-torn world. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to all of this stuff. So Peggy, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jason, and welcome everybody. It's so wonderful to be with you today. And thanks to Pastor Pam Rice for making the arrangements for my husband Rex and I to be able to be here. Well, people often ask me how I got started on this journey, how I got interested in the Seagoing Cowboys. So to begin, I'll share a bit about my own journey first, and then I'll talk about how the Heifer Project came to be, and then the Seagoing Cowboy story. Well, my journey started on a northern Illinois farm. I need to get this slide going here. There we go. I was born into the Church of the Brethren in 1947, and at that time, the Heifer Project was 5 years old. So I grew up just knowing about the Heifer Project. If you were in the Church of the Brethren, it was just part of your DNA, right? What I didn't know was that my grandfather, Abraham Theodore Reiff, had been one of those Seagoing Cowboys. He didn't talk about his experience. We grandkids didn't know to ask, but I was aware that there was a couple Polish dolls up in Grandpa's attic. And I didn't make the connection until after Grandpa died, and my father gave me this envelope of photos from Grandpa's trip to Poland with a load of horses in 1946. By that time, my husband Rex and I had twin daughters, Margot and Abby, and it was in reading book after book to them that I got interested in writing for children. So I signed up for courses through the Institute of Children's Literature. And I wanted to write a young adult novel as my project, and I needed a topic, and those photos of Grandpa Abe just kept beckoning to me. And I decided then to zero in on the story of a 16-year-old seagoing cowboy to Poland. Well, being historical fiction, this of course required a lot of research. So I started interviewing men that I knew had been seagoing cowboys. And one cowboy led to another, and to another, and to another. And their stories were just so fascinating and compelling. And they were full of drama and danger and adventure and humor and even an occasional romance. And I was hooked. But once I started interviewing these men, I soon realized that this history was just hiding away in people's drawers, in their minds, in their attics. So my mission changed to that of documenting this little known rich history. And then I realized that you couldn't tell the history of the Seagoing Cowboys without also telling the history of the Heifer Project. The two histories are intertwined, and that just expanded the scope of my research to the point that now I have 25 bankers boxes full of historical materials in my office from which I draw the history for what I do. That's enough about me. On to the Heifer Project. How did it come to be? What was the impetus behind it? I'm currently working on a book about the first decade of the Heifer Project, up to its incorporation in 1953. And I've come to see that the impetus behind it was a passion for peace. And that was a passion for peace among a group of people in the Church of the Brethren that grew out of the embers of World War I. As we know, the Church of the Brethren was founded on the belief that all war is sin. But yet the church was unprepared for World War I. It had no alternative service in place for its young men. They had three choices. They could either sign up for the military in combat, they could sign up as a non-combatant conscientious objector, or they could choose to go to prison. And Heifer International's founder, Dan West, was one of those young men facing that dilemma. He was drafted at the age of 24 in May of 1918. And he decided that he would sign up as a conscientious objector to test the boundaries of his conscientious objection, he said. And here's what Dan West said about that experience many years later. He said, the sergeant came around one time and he said, and this was during his training period, "How are things going?" I said, "All right." And he thought I meant that I didn't have any more conscientious objection. So I was transferred to the 39th Machine Gun Battalion. When I got there, I went to my new captain to get released. He cursed me hard, evidently to change my mind, but he didn't. A few hours later, I went back with a new idea to go to the Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary. My captain did not curse me anymore, but said he could not move me on then. After a few hard weeks, I was assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. There, I did not kill anybody, but I felt a part of a killing machine. That still hurts my conscience. And I developed a new goal: to work for peace, not for war. That has lasted ever since. Okay, so fast forward 2 decades, and that passion for doing as much for peace as a soldier does for war led Dan West to become the peace representative for the Church of the Brethren. And those 1930s were crucial years for the Brethren, the Mennonites, and the Quakers, the Society of Friends. All 3 denominations shared this passion for peace, and they met regularly throughout that decade and became known as the 3 historic peace churches. Well, in 1937, the Quakers invited the Brethren and the Mennonites to join them in Spain on a project to provide relief for women and children who were caught in the throes of the Spanish Civil War. And they were to work on both sides of the conflict. Well, Dan West was sent as the Brethren representative to the project in late 1937 into early 1938. And he was observing children dying from a shortage of powdered milk. And this basically on a triage basis. Children that weren't gaining weight were taken off the list to die. This just tore at his heart. And he thought of his own little girl at home. Some of you may know Jan Westrock. And he said, this idea struck me hard. Suppose we were unable to provide plenty of food for her right now. I was suddenly determined to do something for these children. And that something, as we know today, was his idea of sending cows to Spain so the people would be able to feed themselves. Simple solution, right? Well, for the optimist that Dan West was, yes, but it would take some heavy convincing for his colleagues back home. But things were happening there too that would pave the way. West wasn't the only one in the Church of the Brethren for whom World War I had inflamed this passion for peace. Rumblings of another war were going on during the 30s. And West and his contemporary, M.R. Ziegler, and other church leaders were pushing for the creation of a Brethren Service Committee. It was formed in 1939. And then 2 years later, in 1941, it became an independent board of the Church of the Brethren, with M.R. Ziegler as its executive secretary. Well, in the meantime, Dan West had been promoting his idea to anyone who would listen to people in the government who he was working with to set up the civilian public service camps, to his colleagues, be they brethren or ecumenical, to the church people in the pews as he traveled around the country with his peace work. Oral history has it that even his wife called it an impossible dream. Well, 4 years later, in April of 1942, the Church of the Brethren District Men's Work of Northern Indiana, where West was living then, took hold of his vision and adopted West's plan for cattle for Europe. Meanwhile, the Brethren Service Committee had also been discussing it, and in June of that year, they approved it as a tentative program. And then in January of 1943, they adopted it as a national program of the Brethren Service Committee, and they named it the Heifer Project, also known as Heifers for Relief back then. Well, the idea took hold, and farmers across the country started raising calves to be sent to Europe. And the Heifer Project was on its way. And it had three strong values in place. One, the animals would go to the neediest of people without regard to race, nationality, religion, or politics. And that was pretty much how the whole Brethren Service Committee operated. Second, the recipients would agree to pass on the gift of their heifer's first female offspring to another family in need. And third, the animals are sent in the name of the master as a gift from Christians in America to show their love and concern. They were not used for proselytizing, and that was very important to Dan West, that they be sent in the name of the master. He wanted no credit at all. By the end of 1943 then, heifers were ready for shipping to Spain. They even had attendants lined up to take care of the heifers on the way over. But at the last minute, Spain, which was under Franco's rule at the time, pulled the plug for whatever reason. And besides, World War II was raging at the time, and it was just nigh impossible to ship anything across the Atlantic that wasn't related to the military. So the first shipment went to Puerto Rico in July of 1944. And this is the year that Heifer International recognizes as their anniversary year, not 1942 when it actually started, but when the first shipment was made. And when the war in Europe ended that next May of 1945, another organization entered the picture. And that was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It's always a mouthful. It was created during the war by 44 of the Allied nations to provide post-war relief. UNRWA, as it was called by its initials, hadn't been planning on sending live cargo in their agricultural rehabilitation shipments. However, M.R. Ziegler, the maverick executive secretary of the Brethren Service Committee, lobbied UNRWA to include Heifer Project animals in their shipments. So when the Near East Foundation decided or requested 6 purebred bulls for their artificial insemination program that they were starting in Greece, UNRWA decided they'd do a test run with the Heifer Project, providing the bulls. And Benjamin Bushong was involved in finding those bulls for the Heifer Project, and that led to his further involvement. And that trip in itself is quite a story. And if you use the internet and want to know more about it, you can go to my blog on my Seagoing Cowboys website. Well, this shipment of bulls was successful. And UNRWA decided, yes, they would include some live cargo in their shipments. But they had a problem. Where would they find the livestock tenders to take care of those animals? Because at that time, most of the men were either still in the military or working in the defense industry. Well, UNRWA knew that the Church of the Brethren was a mostly rural denomination, so maybe they could find enough men on farm deferment for the job. So they called M.R. Ziegler, and he rounded up enough men for that first couple of ships. And that included some Elizabethtown College students, I'll say more about later. So more shiploads followed, and soon the Brethren Service Committee, with much fear and trembling, as the UNRWA report says, entered into an agreement. They agreed that UNRWA would ship the Heifer Project animals free of charge, and in return, the Brethren Service Committee would serve as the recruiting agency for the nearly 8,000 livestock tenders that UNRWA would need to take care of the 200,000 animals, horses, heifers, and mules that they wanted to send to Europe. So the Seagoing Cowboy program was born, with its headquarters at the Brethren Service Center in New Windsor, Maryland. UNRWA only had about a 2-year active lifespan. And they made during that time a total of 360 livestock trips, employing nearly 7,000 seagoing cowboys, transporting some 300,000 animals. And of that, about 4,000 were from the Heifer Project, including this shipment, these animals that you see here on the screen. When UNRWA disbanded then in early 1947, Heifer Project was at a critical juncture. They had little money. They had just lost their free shipping. At that point, they could very easily just have blessed what they had done and terminated the program. But there were two forces that helped provide the momentum that the Heifer Project would need to continue on. One was the grassroots nature of the program. A multitude of volunteers had spent all across the country, had spent countless hours in committee meetings, in raising heifers, in transporting them across the country, and in raising the money to pay for it all. The other force was the seagoing cowboys who came home from their trips, telling their stories of the horrific devastation and tremendous need that they saw in Europe. Well, in April 1947, then, UNRWA's Heifer's first shipment without UNRWA was 25 bulls to Japan, a former enemy country. Shipments of goats followed for Japan and Okinawa. Then heifers were sent to Italy, another country that had been an enemy during the war. And in 1945, a decade of shipments was started for Germany to help this former enemy resettle people of German heritage who had been evicted from their homes in Eastern Europe and sent back to Germany at the end of the war. So you see a pattern here. Now, the Brethren Service Committee was very intent on using the Heifer Project for building peace. As Heifer continued then, without UNRWA's restrictions, women were soon able to be cowgirls. And then air shipments were added with flying cowboys and cowgirls. And the program's mission evolved over the years then from one of simply relief, and then to rehabilitation, and then to development, and now today, to the amazing community building work that Heifer does that lifts people out of poverty through the gifts of animals, and most importantly, the training that teaches people how to use these animals to become sustainable using agricultural practices in environmentally sound ways. It's amazing what they're doing at Heifer Ranch today in terms of training in regenerative agriculture. Well, from its start, the Heifer Project was intent on inviting other denominations to join, and it became ecumenical early on. It was really a unique hybrid because you had all of these denominations working under the Brethren Service Committee. And this ecumenicity gave the Heifer Project a strength far greater than what it could have had on its own with just the Brethren. So today, you'll find Methodists and Presbyterians and even some Mennonites who insist it was their denomination that started the Heifer Project. And I like to think of this as the Brethren Service Committee's way of passing on the gift, releasing a program, ownership of a program for its greater good. On to the Seagoing Cowboys. Who were they? Well, the UNRWA historical report says they were farmers and preachers, teachers, students, veterans, conscientious objectors, ne'er-do-wells and doctors, carpenters, plumbers, painters, and importers. These men and boys from ages 16 to 72 came from a diversity of religious affiliation and racial backgrounds, and they came from nearly every state in the Union as well as Canada. Truly as comprehensive a cross-section of American life as could be found, the report says. Well, a number of these seagoing cowboys came from Elizabethtown. Those who identified themselves as brethren on their record cards are Harry Samuel Gerber, age 22, Harry K. Longenecker, age 20, Claire Martin, age 17, Elias Redkay, age 25, Richard Wenger, age 18, and James Whittle, age 16. Some of those names may be familiar with you and maybe not. And I'm sure there were probably others who just didn't put their religious affiliation on their record card. I'm going to share a couple of the E-Town stories in a few minutes, but first, I want to give you an overview of what it was like to be a seagoing cowboy. So I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations now. Imagine it's 1945. You are still in or just out of high school, 16 or 17 years old. You've just lived through World War II with all of its hype. The newsreels, the bond drives, the recycling campaigns, everything for the war effort. Maybe you had gotten caught up in that hype in high school and secretly wished that the war would last long enough for you to get a piece of the action. Or maybe you followed in the footsteps of your pacifist teaching elders. Maybe you were looking forward to going to civilian public service camp like some of your friends had. At any rate, the war has passed you by and you are itching to do something. Then a call goes out from the Brethren Service Center in newspapers and magazines, over the airwaves, by word of mouth. Men and boys ages 16 to 60 are needed to serve as cattle attendants to take livestock to Europe. Wow, here's your chance for action or adventure. You're under 18, so you're going to need your parents' permission. Could be a hard sell. How many parents today would want to send their 16-year-olds off to Afghanistan? But if you trusted the church leaders involved, it might be an easy permission. If you are 18, you need permission from your draft board to leave the country, which may or may not be given. Some of the men didn't get to go because their draft board said no way. So you send in your application and you get that telegram or a phone call asking you to report, maybe to the Brethren Service Center in New Windsor, most likely directly to your port city. You travel however you can at your own expense, by train or bus, by car or by thumb, maybe with some friends, maybe alone. You've never been out of your county before. So imagine negotiating your way around a strange city that could be New York or Baltimore, or Newport News, or New Orleans, Portland, Maine, or Savannah, Georgia. You go from office to get warshipping administration and Coast Guard approval. You're sent to a 5 and dime store to get your passport photo taken. You endure a physical exam, maybe embarrassing in detail, maybe not. And you get 4 shots, wondering if they used a square needle in your arms. Many cowboys told me that. And after all of this, you end up with ID papers, or that was, if you're early in the program, later in the program, a laminated ID card showing that you are now a member of the U.S. Merchant Marine with the classification of cattleman. And when your ship is ready, you sign on to the ship's articles and you are ready for adventure. Well, if your ship is one of the newer, larger, faster Victory ships that were built at the end of the war, you would be part of a 32-member seagoing cowboy crew, taking care of about 800 animals. And you could expect to be home in 4 to 6 weeks' time if all goes well. If your ship was an earlier, smaller, slower Liberty ship built early in the war, you would be part of a more intimate 16-member crew, taking care of about 335 head of livestock. Your trip could take 2 to 3 months, depending on conditions. If you're a college student, you hope to be assigned to a Victory ship because UNRWA will pay you $150 per trip. So on a Victory ship, you may be able to do 2 or 3 trips during the summer and pay for your whole next year of college. You will also be paid 1 cent per month by the U.S. Merchant Marine. And this was just a token to make you a legal worker on a merchant ship. But once on board, you'll be housed away from the ship's crew in what had been the Navy Armed Guard quarters during the war, under the rear gun deck where you get all the motion of the ship. Or in some cases, the quarters were built in the 'tween deck, the first deck down. You'll eat in your own mess hall with an abundant amount of food, be it holiday or not. And when you get on your way, your trip could be smooth sailing or not. You might adapt to the rolling of the ship or not. And you get to work taking care of the horses assigned to you, or the heifers or mules. You help bring up hay and oats from the lower holds to feed your charges. And if your captain likes his vessel ship shape, you might be instructed to clean up the animal waste daily. Or if your captain is more altruistic, you might let it build up so that the receiving country can clear it off on arrival and have fertilizer for their crops. So imagine being in a closed-in hold with all that fragrance around you with an already queasy stomach from the ship's rocking. Well, all of the animals are bred before shipping so that the receiving country gets 2 for the price of 1. But some of your charges just couldn't wait. So you get to take care of their offspring. And in some cases of heifers, you might even have to milk the cow. If you have a preacher or a ministerial student in your crew, you'll likely have Sunday services on board and maybe even a daily worship time. And this photo comes from one of the crews, Elizabethtown College crews that I'll tell you about later. If the supply of qualified cowboys was low, a Pennsylvania farm boy might find himself with a crew of men hired right off the dock who didn't know the front end from the back end of a horse and could care less. Your trip would be a little more challenging and trying than that of a more homogeneous crew who signed up to do something good for the world. But when you reach your destination, then your work is finished and you are free to explore. If your destination is Greece, you might be able to go to the Acropolis. Or you might be able to see the ruins of Philippi, depending on where your ship landed. In Italy, you might be able to get to Venice if your ship docked in Trieste. Or if it docked in Naples, you might be able to see Pompeii or go to Rome, as this group of guys from Lidditz, high school guys from Lidditz, Pennsylvania, were able to do that. They had a brother serving in the military over there. Well, sightseeing opportunities are quite different if you docked in Bremen, Germany. Germany could not receive UNRWA animals because of being an enemy and being militarily occupied. But the animals that were sent to Czechoslovakia would dock in Bremen, Germany. And there you would witness the horrible devastation of the saturation bombing that had been poured on this city by the British and the Americans. In Bremen, there just wasn't much else to see. You might go to some USO type activities at the occupation military posts nearby, but you watch the German people go on about their lives as best they can. In Poland, you see another city in near total ruins, the city of Danzig, or Gdansk, its Polish name. You're taken on a tour by UNRWA, where you go to battlefields, to collection areas where the farmers are coming to get their horses or heifers. Maybe you're taken to the nearby Stutthof concentration camp. And if you're in one of the earliest crews to dock in Poland in late 1945, you might be taken to a Nazi medical research facility. And there they used the executed prisoners from Stutthof to experiment with making human fat into soap and human skin into leather. The accounts of this in some cowboy diaries are just horrific. After all of that, you're taken to this restaurant in the resort city of Sopot for a banquet put on by the Polish Department of Agriculture to thank you for your service to the Polish people. And you're feeling guilty eating such a full meal, knowing that the people you've been encountering on the streets have been trying to sell you anything that they had left so they could simply buy bread. On your way home then, you have time to think about it all and to talk and to read and to occupy yourself in whatever way you and your shipmates' imaginations can come up with. A couple of ships boarded up the empty gun deck and made swimming pools for themselves. And you come home and you tell your stories to your school, your church, and your newspaper. And when UNRWA ends its work, that 1947, your stories of the devastation and the tremendous need in Europe help give the Heifer Project the momentum it needs to survive after having lost its free shipping with UNRWA. I want to bring the story of the Seagoing Cowboys home right now to Elizabethtown. 5 Elizabethtown College students were on that first ship that M.R. Ziegler lined up the cattle tenders for. It was the SS Virginian, an old merchant ship. Well, at least the students believed it was the first ship. However, a crew simultaneously recruited from the Midwest for an UNRWA shipment to leave from New Orleans departed 2 days ahead of the Virginian on the F.J. Luckenbach. So the Virginian, being on the East Coast, where UNRWA headquarters and the Brethren Service Center were located, received a great deal of media attention. It departed out of Baltimore on June 26, 1945. And the Baltimore Sun and other publications named this one as the first consignment of UNRWA livestock to be sent to Europe. So it was an honest mistake on the part of these Virginian crew that created a great deal of rivalry through the years between the 5 E-Town students on the Virginian and 10 Manchester College students who were on the Luckenbach. But the destination for both ships was Greece. And with Baltimore being closer to Greece than New Orleans, the Virginian arrived in Greece first. So both crews had a claim to a first. Well, being a new endeavor, the Virginian crew documented their experience for the Brethren Service Committee in a booklet that they called Relief for Greece. And the 5 students from Elizabethtown were Lowell Zook, Donald Lefevre, and Richard Winger in this newspaper photo. And then the other 2 were Rufus Bucher and Charles Whitaker. And their ship docked first in Piraeus, which was the port for Athens, where some of the livestock were unloaded. And this gave the Cowboys the opportunity to visit the Acropolis. Then it went on up the coast to Salonika, the Thessalonica of the Bible, where the rest of their cargo was unloaded. And there they got to tour the old city wall. They were taken to the American Farm School, where many young men served in Brethren Service Committee, in Brethren Volunteer Service in later years. And they also were able to visit farms in the country and see the type of farming that they did. And like most cowboys, they saw the effects of war. And they weren't entirely out of danger themselves. As they headed back down through the Aegean Sea, they spotted mines in the water that had been left over from the war. When they got to Naples, Italy, they even saw a sunken ship that had hit a mine, not one of the livestock ships. Being in Naples, though that gave them, they were there for 5 days, it gave them the opportunity to visit Pompeii. They saw Mount Vesuvius, which was active at the time, and they took in some operas. These were from Richard Winger's collection. The Virginian, while they were in Naples, picked up 140 American soldiers who were very eager to be on their way home after some of them spending 3 or 4 years in the war. And this gave the opportunity for these pacifist college students to have a heartfelt discussion with these soldiers. And in this booklet that they wrote, Donald Lefevre wrote this: "A young married fellow with a child he had never seen said, 'We fight, we obey commands, and we aren't supposed to think. In 20 years, my little boy will be fighting the next war, and he won't know why.' And I had to wonder if his son was sent to Vietnam." It was quite a prophetic statement. Another group of Elizabethtown College students took part the next summer then in a special crew of Brethren Seminary and Brethren College students. Walt Gingrich, Frank Keith, and Matt Meyer were still students at E-Town at the time. Guy Book had graduated from E-Town and gone on to seminary at Bethany. Guy was chosen for the crew because he was fluent in German. They gathered at the Brethren Service Center in New Windsor, Maryland, and then they headed on down to Newport News to meet their ship. Before sailing, the seminary students had made a concerted effort to gather relief goods to take with them to distribute overseas. They collected money and they purchased 2 cases of baby food, a case of condensed milk, a half carton of raisins, a carton of liver soup, a case of dried pea soup, and 2 bottles of cod liver oil. They'd hoped to find a children's home to give them to. On June 8, 1946, this select crew boarded the SS Queen's Victory, along with 785 horses, UNRWA horses, that were destined for Czechoslovakia. So that meant that they docked in the port city of Bremen, Germany. And on entering the city, one cowboy noted in his diary, "The town shows every indication of once being beautiful. Now it is rubble. In places, one can smell the rotting bodies under the rubble." And mind you, this was a year after the end of the war. The people go right along in spite of their depressing environment. Upon arrival, the Cowboys set out to find some deserving people to whom to give these supplies that they had brought along. They had also, on the trip across, saved their oranges every morning, and they were able to share them with the children at this Christian day school, most of them never having seen an orange before. And this is one of my favorite photos. This little guy had attached himself to Guy Buch while Guy was being interviewed by the German press. Oh, this Queen's Victory crew wanted to seek out some German Christians with whom they could enter into dialogue. With Guy Buch's fluency in German, that facilitated the finding of Pastor Eric Urban. And it turned out that he was the head Lutheran pastor of Bremen, and he was also an associate of Martin Niemöller. Now, as they discussed possibilities with Pastor Urban, the effects of the war on the German populace was soon brought home to the Cowboys. Before leaving Chicago, the seminary students had planned for a fellowship meal with a group of German Christians. And they had decided that a large quantity of dehydrated soup would serve the purpose well. All the Germans would need to do would be add hot water, right? After meeting Pastor Urban and delighting him and his wife with this prospect of the substitute Lord's Supper, the disadvantages perpetuated by war made themselves known. First, there was a lack of dishes. Then there was nothing in which to heat the soup. And if there had been, it would have been difficult to find any fuel with which to heat it. But the clincher was that Pastor Urban was unable to find a room anywhere in the city which was both intact and large enough to allow the group to sit at a table and eat. Nevertheless, a meeting without a meal was able to be arranged with a group of German Christians, and a rich dialogue and frank dialogue took place, enemy meeting enemy, each realizing that they were, in Pastor Urban's words, as one in Christ. Well, there's one more Elizabethtown connection that I'll mention, and that's Ken Kreider was not a seagoing cowboy, but he was very much a part of the Heifer Project story in Germany, where he spent his Brethren volunteer service in 1955 to 56. He worked out of the newly constructed Brethren House in Kassel, which was the headquarters for all of the Brethren service work in Germany. And he had the job of visiting recipient families a year after they had received their heifer, and to find out their background story, how they and why they had fled from Eastern Europe to West Germany, and how the heifer had affected the family's life. And then he corresponded that information to the donors, which built relationships then. He also was able to go to the distribution ceremonies where the recipient would draw a number from a hat to receive the cow that had that number. And he was able also to attend one of those ceremonies with his father, who had been there as a seagoing cowboy, delivering in person the heifers from the Mechanic Grove Church. That must have been a thrilling experience for him. He also accompanied 2 freight car loads of heifers as a railroad cowboy from the port of Bremerhaven, Germany to Linz, Austria. And you can ask him for details about that amazing experience. So what an amazing opportunity these cowboy experiences were for the young and the old alike. These UNRWA cowboys were some of the first civilians to get into Europe after World War II. So it was witnessing the consequences of war, the way they had left an indelible impression on them, and many of them changed directions, going into occupations of service and ministry. And a prime example of that is Harvey Cox, whom you might recognize as the author of The Secular City. He went to Poland on an UNRWA ship at the age of 17, and he was one of those boys who was disappointed that the war had passed him by. But once he got to Poland, seeing the devastation of the war and the plight of the Polish people, especially the children, it profoundly changed him. And he ended up being an ardent peace activist throughout his adult years. And he wrote a chapter about that in his book, Just As I Am. My thanks to Don Dernbaugh for tipping me off to this. I've already mentioned how the Cowboys provided the momentum for the Heifer Project to continue going. Well, the Heifer Project carries a rich legacy, and it's illustrated by 2 visits that I made in Europe in 2013, where I had the phenomenal opportunity to meet recipients of Heifer Project animals from 1945 in Poland. This man, Stanislav Debert, I was able to talk with and hear the importance of that heifer to him. And then I was able to meet 11 families in Germany who had received heifers in 1950. They had been part of people of German heritage who had been living in Eastern European countries who were sent back to Germany at the end of the war through the Potsdam Agreement. And there were 10 to 12 million of these people that the German government had to find a place for. One of those places was in the Reichswald in Northwest Germany, where they had to clear a forest that was damaged by the war. And the Heifer Project sent 48 heifers to this community in 1950 to help the people get on their feet again. And one statement made by Mariana Quelling Arts summarizes the importance of the Heifer Project shipment for these people and for the nearly 4,000 other resettled heifer recipient families throughout Germany. Mariana said, when they received their heifer, they wondered who would give us such a large gift. She said, up to that point, everything had been taken away from us. Who would give us a cow? She said, our heifer lifted us from the depths of despair and gave us hope. And folks, that's the legacy of the Seagoing Cowboys and of the Heifer Project. And I think I'll stop right there to see if you have any questions in the few minutes that we have left.
Peggy, thank you so much for sharing with us. What a fantastic presentation that was. Just wonderful. We do only have 5 minutes, and this is one of those days we wish we had an hour to talk to you and ask questions. So I will just I'll turn it over, but I'll ask individuals to keep your questions very brief, and so we can try and to get through some of this. I'll note that in the chat there was a comment that acknowledged the individuals you had mentioned from Elizabethtown College before you ended up getting to them in the presentation. So thank you for doing that.
Jason, this is Lois. I sent you another name to forward to Peggy. Matt Meyer was also with Guy Book, Frank, and Walt Gingrich. They were all basketball players together. They were quite a crew by themselves. And I think somewhere I have a picture of them with their ship, which I will try to find and get to you.
Thank you.
They were,
Thank you.
they were on the Queen's Victory.
Matt is one of the Cowboys that I've interviewed.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
Any other questions and comments? I mentioned this in the sermon today, but my grandfather was on the Zona Gale. Don Crable, I see.
Yes, I just wanted to put in a good word for Mount Joy. Down the road here, there were several Mennonites from the Mount Joy area. My grandfather was one of them, and I think Dave Reiff's father was one of them. There were also several from the Mount Joy Mennonite Church. I don't know what the total is, but they are kind of next door neighbors here.
I've interviewed some of them as well. Yeah.
I also wanted to mention I had an uncle who was an Amish 18-year-old at the time who got on to one of the ships that took heifers to Germany.
Would that have been Clarence Stoltz?
No, John Stoltzfus.
John
from-
Stoltz. Okay.
Hey, Jason,
Yes.
Craig Coble here. There might be another connection to E-Town, and maybe Ken Kreider would know about this. But one of the issues with sending draft animals overseas at that time was there were very few harnesses. And the Franz Harness Shop here in Elizabethtown made hundreds of harnesses and sent them over after the war to get those draft animals into a useful position.
That's
And
correct.
There are pictures of that shop with hundreds of harnesses hanging from the rafters. Ken, do you know about the timing on that?
That's correct. Thank you for putting that in. Also, when they sent the horses to Greece later on, we went to Greece and asked them if they remember getting those horses, and they said, yes, we ate them. But at that time, the draft horses were important, but they also were used for food.
Peggy, is it also
Right.
true that many of the animals, some of the animals did not make it across the trip? They lost some of them it wasn't an easy trip for the animals or the people, I suppose.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. But
Great.
we still had a pretty good record. I think the loss rate was something like 3.8% overall.
That was on the animals. We didn't lose any cowboys, did we?
We did, I'm sorry. Yeah, there was an accident going up Mount Etna where a truck overturned and 3 cowboys lost their lives in that accident. And 1 man died from cancer on the trip. So yeah.
One died from Mechanic Grove Church of the Brethren. And somebody said, well, isn't that too bad that he died while in Germany? And the response was, well, it was just as close to heaven from there as it is from here.
I believe I see a hand raised. I don't know. I don't know if that's intentional or not. Levon, did you have something you wanted to add? Perhaps not. As we conclude our time together here, I would invite you to join us in worship today. We are talking about service, and Peggy will be joining us for our children's time today. There's also a number of books that are going to be available here at church after worship, before worship, and some things for the kids to get to after church today. So make sure you take the time to tune in or show up this morning. We look forward to having you with us. But before we go, Peggy, did you have any parting thoughts or words that you could gift us as we wrap up our time together?
I think just my gratitude for the spirit of people here at Elizabethtown and the tremendous contributions you've made to the history of the Church of the Brethren. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We'll look forward to seeing you either in church, in the live stream, or next week here in Sunday school. Take care.